All right. Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third day of Fundamentals of Research. Um, we have people still joining us, maybe a lazy Sunday for someone. So I think we'll wait for maybe 2 or 3 minutes before we move on to discussing about how we actually write research papers. And then we move on to being joined by Dr. Rujuta, who will answer any and all questions you guys have. Um, so yeah, so maybe we'll start in a couple of minutes. All right, so I think we can begin now. Again, a very good afternoon and a happy Sunday to everyone who's joined here with us today. Um, Today, I'll just take a small recap of the stuff we've spoken about on day one and day two so that you don't feel lost if you're joining us today. And then we can move on to how do you actually write an article and what other opportunities there are for medical students in the research world. So just allow me to share my screen. And, perfect. Right. Um, so just a small recap of the topics we've spoken about. Um, we started with selecting a research topic and how you need to move from a broad subject area to a narrow one. Um, we spoke about the difference between a research topic and a research question, um, where you have to go from one topic can be used for multiple questions. So you can define the who, what, why, when, where. Before starting your study, you need to confirm whether it's feasible or not, whether you can draw blood of 200 people if you're studying something related to that, whether you have enough funding for all the tests, if you have a microbiology test, or if you have sort of some sort of software that you need before you complete your project. The novelty of the idea, that's where literature analysis becomes the most important. You need to go back. We spoke about yesterday how we can go through Google Scholar, go through PubMed, look at research papers that have already been done, maybe get ideas from a few of them, and figure out what the best case scenario for the Indian population or the Asian population is. The Google Scholar benefits I mentioned was larger than PubMed. Article quality is not as reliable as PubMed, although articles that are indexed in PubMed would also be in Google Scholar. However, Google Scholar has articles from all over, all backgrounds and fields, including law, commerce, business, etc. And also a lot of journals which may or may not have stringent protocols to see whether the research is appropriate or not. You have to establish some keywords. The order of the keyword matters when you're searching in Google Scholar. So whatever's the major keyword you keep in first in your search, and then the rest you can keep in the latter part of your search. You can set up Google alerts to say particular searches so that you can be completely up to date with any and everything about a particular topic, any new paper that's come out in that topic. PubMed, we spoke, is the most reliable database. We spoke about mesh vocabulary, what headings are, what the tree branch structure of the headings of mesh vocabulary are, how do you further define a mesh vocabulary with subheadings, and how that helps us filter down the results that we get when we're searching on PubMed. Here are some that we spoke about, some alternatives to paying for articles, including the ResearchGate website where you can directly contact an author. There's an unpaywall.org extension on Chrome. There are some illegal methods that I do not endorse, including Sci-Hub and LibGen, which some people may choose to use. Spoke about when you're trying to identify, once you have identified your research question, you have to identify your target population and therefore your study population. And we saw this chart yesterday where we said that the study population is a small fraction of your target population. That study population is actually the people who you're going to go up to, ask questions, get data from them, etc. And that helps you define your target population. And that also helps other researchers know when to apply, whether or not to take the results that you have gotten in your study and use it in their clinical practice. We laid down some inclusion and exclusion criteria of how we need to define if someone is sitting right across us, if we are to include them in a study, and if they meet inclusion criteria, do they meet any other criteria that would exclude them from the study or not? So that is your inclusion exclusion criteria that you need to have. It allows you to define your population very narrowly so that there are no mistakes or confusion about what sort of patients you had, whether they were only pediatric, whether they were older, whether they had certain conditions associated with them, how you define those conditions. So consider you say that I was doing a study on tumors, right? So brain tumors, and I want to see, I was working with a surgeon and he was trying to see what is the recurrence rate of a brain tumor after surgery. So we have to define that we only included tumors which are above 1 cc or 2 cc, etc., confirmed on MRI imaging and stuff like that. Exclusion could be a syndromic sort of situation where a person's mortality or the recurrence rate would be much higher in this particular syndrome. So we excluded those patients from our study. So that defines your inclusion exclusion criteria. It helps you define your population narrowly so that you yourself are also not confused about yourself are also not very confused about how you are going to choose patients for your study. So we also spoke about the prerequisites for the studies. You have to have an informed consent document, whether it's at least on telephone or preferably in a paper format, signed by the patients that you are trying to get information from. It could also be online if you're taking a survey. Make sure that the first page of the survey is an informed consent document. We spoke about what all questions to include in that document. You need ethics committee approval even before a survey, so that they make sure that there is no basically funny business going on while you're taking that survey. You need to visit a statistician so that your questions can be framed accordingly. A lot of people, what they do is they have the survey, then they go to a statistician and say, okay, here is the data we have. But instead, he or she could give you more information about how to frame your question so that the appropriate tests could be used for that question instead of it just becoming a useless piece of data. We also said, once we spoke about PubMed, we went on to see about how to assess a journal for reading. Is it for a specified reader base, whether it's for people who are specializing in surgery, orthopedics, pediatrics, etc. Is it international or region specific? So if you're studying about the prevalence of an or the incidence of a disease in, say, a state in India versus studies from the US would probably not be useful to you. Then if it's open access or paid viewership, open access means that all journal articles are free for you to view and read the full text of. And you can definitely see the impact factor and altmetric score that Dr. Parag spoke about. The impact factor is basically a mark. So like teachers give us marks on our papers, right? On our SAQs, on our LAQs, and whenever we write some sort of term ending paper. The impact factor is a similar mark given to these journals. So an impact factor of usually more than one is good. If you go on the journal website, and you can usually see you can usually see a homepage like this where they have how many issues they have per year, what the impact factor is. Usually an impact factor of more than one is taken as good. However, you also need to see where these journals are indexed, and preferably publish in Medline indexed or PubMed indexed journals. You'd find this information in either for authors or in a tab which says current indexing or indexing guidelines, etc. And preferably don't go for predatory journals which are just only indexed in places like Copernicus or Scopus. Go for journals which have a Medline indexation, because once you start writing a lot of articles, you realize that the number of articles you write is not important. It's the number of times you've been cited that's important. And like we spoke, a lot of usually everyone who's doing some sort of research will go on PubMed and search for articles instead of Google Scholar. So your chances of being cited are much more if it's PubMed index, because that's usually where people search for papers, and that's how they read that paper and say, okay, hey, I can reference this in my article. And that's why it's important to have PubMed indexed articles, PubMed indexed journals where you submit your articles. So at least I would say that at least try those journals first and then move on to others if you are not getting acceptance. However, you can see that some journals will say that we have PubMed indexation waiting. So that does not mean that they have appropriate indexation in PubMed, and therefore should not be considered as PubMed indexed yet till they get that approval. The PubMed website also has a journals tab where you can very clearly see what journals are indexed or not indexed in PubMed, so that if there's any fake journal out there that's claiming PubMed indexation and doesn't have it, you can easily spot the fake. This is the example of an article page. It gives you information about the DOI, which is a unique ID issued to each and every article. The name of the journal, the research article is a type of article that you're seeing here. Open access again means that it's free for anyone to access. The authors have already paid a fee for it to be free, open access. The title of the article is right here. So just with the title, you can know whether or not this study would apply to you when you're doing your background research, if it's along the similar lines of what you are trying to study, and if you can gain any information from it in terms of the methodology or the results that they have received. Usually there is a corresponding author. So if you have any questions about an article, And with the star you see here, underneath the article, you'll find information, maybe on the first page or the last page, you'll find information about corresponding author, where the postal address and usually the phone number and email address of the corresponding author is given. So if you have any questions and you want to ask them, I'm trying to replicate this study in India, and if you could help me out, you will have to try hard for them to reply to you, but I am sure that you'll be able to get some help from some of these people who are really usually very helpful. The extra information in articles, you can see the funding source. So if the study is on the effectiveness of remdesivir, and if you see that Gilead Sciences has funded this study, then you maybe take it with a pinch of salt, or you pay extra attention to the methodology of and how they came up with the results, so that you're absolutely confident that there is no funny business going on just because of funding and the authors may be fudging the results. So that's why they have this funding declaration, so that they're not hiding anything from anyone. You can see the article for itself. You can pay as much attention to it as you want. They've written the whole methodology so that you realize that it is not fudged, or it's not the data is not manipulated, right? So yeah, so if you see this, the 1, 2, and 3 that was written in the previous slide refers to the 1, 2, and 3 that's written in the author details, where you'd find where those authors actually attached to. And you can do that for Indian journals as well, where you go to, say, the Indian Journal of Orthopedics or Indian Journal of Surgery or Indian Journal of Medicine, and see if there are any authors who are recurring in articles. And if they are, maybe say in your home state or in your home city, then you can maybe contact them for any research articles that you need, and they'd be able to help you out that way. These are the basic components of an article. We're going to talk about how to write an article today. So that's why it's important to know the components of an article, and the best way to do that is to actually read articles quite often in your favorite subject, maybe about vaccines of COVID, or any sort of article you want. Even if you may not completely understand it at first, go to Google, search what particular words mean, or how the methodology has been constructed, and you definitely get your answers there. It'll help you develop a sort of curious mind, and it'll help you develop your own methodology in the future. So it starts with title, authors, abstract is described in short what was done. Usually it's less than 250 words, 300 words. Each journal has their own specification. The keywords are something that you have to write while submitting your article to the journal. Again, these keywords are not related to the PubMed keywords, because they have their own indexers for them. But you can definitely go on the same mesh website we discussed yesterday and identify some keywords for yourself and writing these keywords. The introduction explains the problem, the methods and results, explain how data were collected, and results describe what results, what you actually found from your study, what data you discovered, and what patterns emerged from that. Discussion essentially places your article in the bigger scheme of things, as in the past 5 years, these are the studies that have been conducted, and our articles results compared so and so to them. And that's the discussion part of an article. And you have acknowledgements if there is anyone who has helped you, maybe a junior who you don't think needs authorship because of his effort, but even if someone has helped you a little bit, you can include them in the acknowledgements. And make sure you don't leave anyone out, because it becomes quite a competitive field otherwise, if we're not helping each other do research. Again, references are the specific. We talk about EndNote today as well, and how references work and what you need to do for that. And once you submit your article to a journal, it goes through a peer review process where after the paper is submitted, the journal confirms that it has received your paper. The editor then decides whether the article structure is appropriate depending on author or the journal guidelines. The journal guidelines can be found in instructions to author or author guidelines. That's on the web page of every journal, where you can see exactly how many words they need for the abstract, what order of introduction methods or any specific title heading that they need before you submit it, how your tables need to be framed, how your images need to be framed, etc. So the editor will decide whether or not your article meets the journal guidelines for that. And if it doesn't, he'll send it back to you for changing that. And even if it's all perfect, he may decide to reject it outright if he deems that the article is not um, in lines with the aims and scope of the journal. So if you submit a neurosurgery article in a radiology journal, you be rest assured that it will be rejected, right? Um, and then if he decides to review it, he will assign some reviewers. So reviewers are essentially like your teachers who answer your, who correct your answer sheets whenever you submit a semester end or year end exam. Uh, each one has an individual say in whether or not the paper will be accepted. They will write their own comments. And in the end, they will get an option saying accept paper with corrections, accept paper outright, or reject paper, right? Um, so if you don't get a majority of reject papers from the reviewers, it goes back to the editor and he will say, okay, these are the corrections that the reviewers have recommended. You will give the corrections back to the editor and he will send them out to reviewers again to see whether or not the corrections you have put are adequate and are acceptable to them. And if they are, they will choose to accept it. So that's exactly how the peer review process works. Peer means someone who's a colleague or who's an equal to you. And that's why experts in their fields are reviewing your paper to determine whether or not the methodology is sound and the results you have brought are important for the community at large. And that's the peer review process that we talk about. So as you can see in this image, there are a multitude of indexing websites available. The most in the biomedical field, the most lucrative or the most sought after is PubMed. So try to make sure that the articles you submit are at least in the PubMed indexed journals, so that you can be easily cited, people can find your work, and you can grow from there. We again spoke about how PubMed works. We saw that there is a small journals tab at the bottom of the PubMed website where you can see what journals are there. You can just type in surgery or you can type in pediatrics and it'll give you what information is available. Oh, sorry, what journals are there relating to those fields that may or may not be indexed in PubMed. So I'll just show you guys how that works in a bit. But if you search, say, for hepatology, you will find all a result of all the journals that at one point at least were indexed in PubMed or Medline. So if you click on any one of those results, this will be the page you'll be met with. You see information about the journal, you see what year it started, where it started from, and you see the current indexing status, which says not currently indexed for Medline. So this means that it's not in the Medline database and therefore may not be in the PubMed database either, right? So, but it does say that it's in PubMed and in PMC. So that's why I explained to you that PubMed is just a search methodology for Medline. There may be some journals which are indexed in PubMed but not in Medline. So that's why this says it is indexed in PubMed since 2016 and 2018. There you'll find links to the journal itself, so you can go directly on their website, see what the impact factor is, etc. But this is essentially a good way to determine the names of journals that are there and what you can do with them, right? But it says it's currently not indexed for Medline, so it's best to make sure that it is indexed for Medline. Those would be the most sought after journals. Dr. Parag Dumne mentioned this: to find out if a journal is predatory, we as medical students have not earned the right of a journal directly contacting us, requesting us for publication because they have an issue to submit and we're lacking one or two articles, and we'd be honored if you could submit your work to our journal. Usually those are predatory journals. They will definitely publish your paper in that journal. However, the journal is of no value. It's not indexed in appropriate indexing places, and if a person, you take your CV to anyone who sees where you have published your work, and if they all turn out to be, or quite a few turn out to be predatory journals, and they realize that you also have not worked hard in your research paper, and it was not accepted to journals with a good standing, and that's why you are submitted here. And instead of boosting your CV, you'd be degrading your CV, right? So yeah, so if they are contacting you, and if they have an email of at google.com or at yahoo.com, make sure that um, they're usually predatory, right? So you can maybe take a screenshot of this, and next time someone contacts you, or you're trying to look at a journal to publish somewhere, you can figure out whether it's predatory or not. So I think that covers our review of what we have discussed over these past few days. And if you guys have any questions so far on this before we move on to how to actually write a research paper, please do let me know in the comment section while I change my slides. Are there any questions, IMA team?
There's one question.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get access to paid journals if we get support from a person who already works on different research? I mean, do they have free access for people who are employed in Tata and all companies that are involved in research? Do they give free access to people?
Like I mentioned, a lot of colleges have free access to journals. A lot of libraries have free access to journals. So it's best to ask them, because they're usually associated with, say, Ovid or something that gives you free access. So it's best to just ask them whether or not they have access. But usually most libraries do have access.
Are there any free training courses available online for paper writing?
Ooh, I personally, there have been courses on how to improve your paper writing. It's a course by Stanford. I had taken it back in the day, but unfortunately, that website. I don't think it's active anymore. It was called Stanford Lagunita, Lagunita. However, I don't think it's active anymore. And they did have a lovely course there on biomedical statistics and how to improve your writing, not just research writing per se. But yeah, I'm sure you can find them on Coursera, or you can audit the course on Coursera, because yeah, definitely you can try to do that. But I personally have not come across such courses on how to write research papers specifically, because there is no one good way to write research papers. So what we're going to discuss today is just the basics of what to include in the different sections of a research paper. However, depending on the scope of your research, what type of article you're writing, what are the aims and objectives of your research, obviously everything inside the paper is going to change, right? It's like asking someone how to write an essay. I mean, it depends on what you're writing about. So there can't be one foolproof method of research writing, or there can't be one course of research writing, but it helps to understand the basics. And as you move forward with your research career, you'll understand, okay, this is where I made a mistake. The reviewers will tell you, okay, this is not what should have been done. This is what should have been done instead. And that's how you'll improve your research writing, right?
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, is that it?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Perfect, then. We can start with the fundamentals of manuscript preparation. So manuscript preparation essentially refers to, manuscript refers to your article that you're writing, right? The paper, as we so call, is called a manuscript. And we're going to talk about how we write these papers. But before that, let's understand a little in depth of how they are evaluated, so that we can be best um, uh, um, we can be best equipped with how to write them. Because the first thing we do when we have an exam is to see the previous year's questions and how people have been evaluated before, and that's the best way to write our papers, right? So essentially, like I said, in the peer review process, it's the most common and widely accepted way to evaluate articles. This process involves your peers, that is your colleagues, judging whether the article you have submitted is technically sound, has novel ideas to the subject, and if the wider audience or people who are practicing this particular specialty would gain something from your article, right? It's important to understand that initial journal checks, which determine whether your article should be peer reviewed or not, are just based on your title and abstract. So the initial checks by the editor and his team would only read your title and abstract and not the whole paper. So you need to make sure that those two things you have absolutely hammered down, right? So it's therefore very important that you pay attention to these sections and absolutely highlight your novelty and real world applicability in your title and abstract, right? So once you have initial journal checks, the editor decides that everything is up to code, the abstract and title seem good enough for consideration, and if all the layout of the article is absolutely appropriate, they'll send it to peer review. Then after peer review, if they accept your article, if they have some comments, they send it back to you. If not, they'll accept your article, and outright accepting is absolutely very rare. You're definitely going to have some comments from reviewers on mostly all your articles. I've personally never had an article being outright accepted, and if it is, you should maybe check if the journal is predatory or not. And after that, you have your final journal checks and production if they have accepted your article, where you just decide what table to place where, and a few maybe spelling mistakes that are present in your article, which will be corrected. Then after that, your article will be published depending on the mode of the journal, whether it's just an online only journal or it has a printed version available. That's when your article will be published. So although there are other ways to review articles, peer review has been steadily growing in the past few years. Earlier, what used to happen was instead of peer review, only the editor would decide whether or not your article is worth publishing in his or her journal. But instead, now they have a team of reviewers who they send the article to, who are specialists in a particular field. And that's how they decide. And if a majority of them decide to publish it, that's how it's published. So it's not dependent on just one person who may have some sort of beef with a person who's submitting the article and it gets rejected over and over again. So as you can see, from 2001 to 2013, which is the most recent data that was available, the number of journals that have peer, the total number of journals per year has increased from 20,000 to 30,000. That's almost a 50% increase, right? And since 1991, when there were only about 3,000 peer-reviewed journals, at present there are more than 30,000 peer-reviewed journals, indicating that other forms of reviews, such as editor reviews, are soon heading out the door, and peer review is here to stay. So these are just some stats for someone who may have a paper rejected. Just remember that 30 to 60% of all papers received by a journal are rejected by editors, right? And so therefore make sure that your layout is appropriate, your title and abstract are absolutely hammered down. So they say that out of 1 million articles they receive every year, 30 to 60, so this is based on the Elsevier website, which says that they receive more than 1 million articles a year. 30 to 60% are rejected outright based on title and abstract. Using the almost 600,000 reviewers that I have, they accept only about 365,000 articles every year. This includes all journals that are part of the Elsevier house, whose number runs in the thousands, right? So in all of Elsevier in 2011, they accepted only 365,000 articles from all over the world. So don't be disheartened if you don't get accepted into a few journals in the start, and make sure that you have hammered down all the points from the reviewers and you've made those changes, made appropriate changes, and only then submit to the next journal and not think, oh, these guys are not understanding what I'm trying to say, and I think I'm smarter than them, etc. Right? So the first journal that actually started peer review was back in 1618 AD, which is way ahead of its time. Over the year, it's become a tried and tested way of evaluating article. Its basic purpose is for colleagues in the same field to evaluate your research and ensure that the article you have submitted is suitable to the journal you have submitted, and it's new and it can be used by people who are reading your article, right? So one great aspect of the peer review process that is, even if your article is rejected by the editor after the reviewer comments, you will still get some expert feedback on the same. This will allow you to amend your article before submitting it to another journal. The process that most journals follow is the editor receives the paper, checks the paper, sees that it fits the aims and scopes. He selects a few reviewers, usually 2, 3 of your peers. The reviewers then review the paper, provide the comments and suggestions, and whether they should reject, revise, or accept the paper. Editor checks the reviews, send them to the authors with any additional guidance. So it's not like olden times, or it's not like a college application where you have just been rejected without giving you any reason. If your article has made it through the editor, made because of a good title, because of a good abstract, because of novelty, um, your reviewers will review it and you will get comments back, even if your article is rejected, right? So you will have something to hear from and some modifications to make in your article. So now that you've understood how your final article is going to be evaluated, we can now move on to discussing how you should prepare that article in order to decrease your chances of a rejection by a journal. Carefully evaluate the tipping of these scales. If you know that you have multiple data errors leading to incorrect conclusions, if there is any duplication of already published work, or if there is already some new proven drug technology that has overtaken what your study seems to determine, save yourself some time by not trying to publish your research. What we all need to understand is that research is research. Publishing just for the sake of it decreases the overall reliability of the work that is published and increases the burden of the system with outdated articles. It's our duty as ardent researchers to prevent such abuse to the system, right? So if you have some sort of article where you're trying to determine this new technology, and if there are already 50 papers on it, where you're like, no, I've worked so hard on this, I have to publish it. But you need to realize the bigger picture that already we have so many articles which may or may not be methodologically sound, but due to these predatory journals have made their way on the websites and have become part of Google Scholar and something that people search every day, just increases the burden of someone trying to get accurate information. So if you know already that you have some weak methodology or some multiple data errors that cannot be solved, because in the peer review process, they are definitely going to realize whether your data has been fudged, and they may ask you for your data if they think that it has been fudged, and therefore just avoid publishing. It's okay. It's disheartening that you wasted your time with that, but you should definitely try to move on to the next topic, or maybe have some modifications to the data that you did get correctly, right? Oops. Yeah. So as with all the steps taken so far in the research process, it's imperative to plan the steps before starting your research. So the first thing you need to do is determine the type of article you are writing, whether it's a full article, whether it's a review paper, whether it's a short communication or letter. Um, Usually a short communication or a letter is something that we have seen a lot in COVID times, where some people have some thrilling results with, say, a particular corticosteroid therapy protocol, or some particular drugs where the results are so thrilling that you need to share them ASAP. So those are called letters or short communications. Review papers, as we said, are a summary of all existing research on a particular topic, and full articles are comprehensive pieces of research with experimentations or interventions or observations done by you specifically, and will enter some new information into the research world compared to review papers, which are essentially just summarizing information that's already available. Then uh, after that, you need to choose your target journal before starting writing. You can make a rough draft of your article, definitely. However, because each journal has their own layout that they need, their own types of tables, their own types of figures, etc., it's best to identify maybe 2 or 3 target journals. Identify the most revered one where your chances of getting accepted are a little higher, maybe something with a relatively lower impact factor, but still indexed in PubMed, um, and see what the instructions to authors are and write your journal article accordingly. Um, it uh, it not only this process not only helps your article from being rejected outright by the editor, but it also allows your it makes sure that your target audience is met through the journal. So before you start writing, make sure that you don't have to have too many changes in the article because you've decided to submit to this journal instead of that. So make sure you have a list of maybe 3 or 4 journals that you need to submit and move down that list one by one, because I don't know if you guys know, but it's you cannot submit your article to more than one journal at a time. And most of these journals have editorial manager, and they can realize that you have submitted to more than one place, and then your article would be rejected from all journals that are associated with it. So make sure you have a list of 3 or 4 journals that are important to you and you have identified through PubMed or through other means, and start going from the top to the bottom of that list as you modify your research paper and submit to them one by one, only after you have been rejected from the first one, right? And sometimes journals may take 4 to 8 weeks to sometimes 12 weeks. I personally have had my article with journals without a reply from for about maybe 6 months also. But at that time, you need to take a call. If they're taking too much time, you can say, I would like to rescind my application for publishing, and you can choose to submit in the next journal that you have, right? So what you need to do is find the right journal, identify your intended audience, ask supervisors, and shortlist a handful of candidate journals. Search the journal website, see its aims and scopes, see if your article objectives and aims meets the aims of the journal. See the accepted type of articles. Sometimes journals nowadays have stopped accepting case reports and have their own sort of sub journal where they have only case reports being submitted. So make sure that your article type is accepted in the journal so that you know that it's right for you and if your article fits into their guidelines. However, before you start writing, select one shortlist and then prepare accordingly, as submission to one more than one journal is prohibited. Um, Another tip to see which journals you can possibly submit to is see the references you have used in your article. See what background research you have done. See where those articles have been published in what journals, and then you can explore those journals and see if it's appropriate for your paper, right? So once you have your journal decided, you have a few journals in your mind, you can start preparing your articles. Always refer to the guide for authors of your target journal. It gives you information about what they expect from you, how many words, whether the abstract needs to be structured, non-structured. We talk about what that means in a second. Um, but it lists out all the specifications, right from the subheadings that you need in your paper to the style of references that they are looking for, right? So a short recap is determine if you are ready to publish your work, determine if your work is good enough to be published, if you have no data or very minimal data errors which do not fudge your results, if you have if you and decide on the best type of manuscript, whether you need to write a review article, whether it's a case series, a case report, or original article. Choose what article is the best type for you. Choose the target journals and check the guide for authors for information about the layout and what you exactly need when you're writing your article. Like I mentioned before, this is the general structure of the article. It moves from title, abstract, keywords. to the main crux of the article, which is essentially introduction, methods, results, and discussion, and then conclusion, references, and supporting materials. And that's yeah. So it would be best to make the title, abstracts, and keywords as informative, as attractive, and as effective, so that it's easy to index, easy to search, and it's accepted by your editor quite easily. So this is instead of writing in the sequence that was presented here, which is how your actual article will look like there is a sequence to reading the article, is where first you go to the title and abstract, then you move on to the discussion and results. You see the figures and tables, and then you see the methods and introductions in the last. There is a certain way to building your article to make sure that you're not completely confused while writing it. And this is the most efficient way that I have found, and that other people have found as well, is you start from your figures and tables. You make sure that you have your data in tables or figures already, so that you know what exactly the main points of your article are, what the main results are, what the most exciting results are. Then you move on to write your methods, which is fairly easy to write because it's essentially just saying what you have done, how where your study was based, what your inclusion exclusion criteria were, what exact methods did you follow, if you used any equipment, information about equipment, what your statistical plan was, what your data management plan was, and how you moved on from there. So there, you don't need any references in the methods section usually, unless you're referencing to a particular software. And it just basically involves writing what you did to obtain this data. Results section again is very easy because you have to write just sentences with your results, maybe subdivided into categories. So if I have a total knee replacement that was done for people with a tumor, or people with arthritis, or people with or some other pathology, right? I would divide them into subsections under the results section, so that people would not be confused while reading my article. So your main aim when writing an article is to make sure that your reader is not confused, right? Then you move on to the discussion where you say, okay, these are the previous studies that have been done, or this is what my study is showing compared to theirs. So you may agree with some results that have been published. It's not everything needs to be new, where, oh, they showed this, but I'm showing this. That doesn't need to be the case. You can say that this study has been done. We found similar results. However, this is the point of differentiation. This is what new finding we found, which they maybe missed, etc. So that's how you move from figures and tables to methods, results, and discussion. Then after that, you write your conclusion. Conclusion is usually a small one para, I would say about 50, 60 word conclusion of your article, what exactly you are trying to say from your article, what an average physician would conclude, how it would make a difference to his personal life, etc. Then you move on to introduction, where you write about define your study and how where it lies in the broader scope of the research or the topic or the science, right? After you've done that, spend a so after you've done this, you have a basic idea of what your article is trying to say, right? You have your methods, result, discussion, you have your conclusion, you have your introduction. After that, once you have that all in your head, you write your title, abstract, and your keywords, because they are the most important. I would say spend the most time on them. And after you have this basic idea, only then you should write your abstract, keywords, and title. Right? Usually what people do is write a title, start introduction, then write material, methods, move on to results, etc., and then write abstract in the last. But I would say write your title, abstract, and keywords in the last, because unless you've written this paper in this order, you will not understand what the nuances are, what the important information you're trying to divulge is. Because usually when we have a sort of survey, sort of questionnaire, we have tons of different information. We don't know what to focus on. And therefore, when you are actually writing this paper, you say, oh, this is interesting where these people showed this, but I'm trying to show this. And that's the highlight of my paper. And that should be included in the abstract or in the title, right? So this is how you should actually start building your article, move from middle to down to up. Doesn't make the most sense aesthetically, but does make this most sense while writing it. So let's move on to the methods section of the article. Here you describe how the problem was studied, what methods you used, how did you arrive at your target population, mention all inclusion exclusion criteria that we discussed. If you have used any specific equipments, for example, a vernier caliper to measure the mid upper arm circumference, um, or say the length of something, um, or if you used a bangle to measure the mid upper arm circumference of a child, uh, make sure that you mention what exact equipment you have used, maybe its diameter, and if it has a particular brand that you have used, that's something that you can mention in your method section as well. Or if you use some specific drug, mention the company that it was used from, and so the basic purpose of this section is to ensure that you have written any and all information that would be required for someone to recreate that study. So that's the whole point of a method section, where if someone was to start from scratch tomorrow, he, by reading your method section, he would be able to exactly replicate your study, right? And that's how someone who's reading this section can understand what exact methodology was used, whether they see any flaws in it, whether they see any merits in it. And that's how, so basically, it should answer the following questions of who, what, why, when, where. Um, and it should definitely mention ethics committee approval. It should mention an informed consent of obtaining of informed consent from your study participants, what your statistics plan was, what studies you used, what was the level of significance you used, how did you arrive at your sample size, what was the appropriate sample size that you came to. So those are the essential parts of a method section, again, where someone could exactly replicate your study. So the whole idea is that of research initially, when it was started, was the first person who reports it would be great, but the merit of the study would only be when someone replicated that study and obtained the same results. That's when you would say that, oh, this study is actually pretty great, right? Because that's the whole point of research, that within a margin of error, you should get the same results if you have used the same methodology. We've lost on that in the past few decades, but that's a topic for another day. So this is a particular paper that I myself have written, and you can see the example of dividing your method section into different subsection, which is what I usually tend to do. Um, is we have the study site on where we did the paper, what protocol we used to treat the children, any study designs and study samplings, and what the questionnaires and data collection were, what questions we asked the patients, what our management of data was, how we collected it, how we analyzed it, what sort of tests we use. So instead of being just a whole big paragraph in your article, it can be divided into subsection where people can get information that they're seeking. So, oh, they're saying, where was the study done? It was done in a tertiary care center or a primary health care center, etc. So that really helps you instead of confusing your reader more, because he is reading a 3,000 word or 4,000 word article, and he has to read many more in his background research phase. So it helps them identify information that they are seeking quite directly. So some do nots of the methods section. Do not go into irrelevant detail. The methodology section of the paper should be thorough but to the point. Don't provide any background information that doesn't directly help the reader to understand why a particular method was chosen, how the data was gathered or obtained, and how it was analyzed. Don't explain unnecessarily the some basic procedures. Remember that you're not writing a how-to guide about a particular method. You should make the assumption that readers possess a basic understanding of how to investigate the research problem on their own, and therefore you do not have to go into great detail about specific methodological procedures. The focus should be on how you applied a method, not on the mechanics of doing a method. uh, Note that an exception to the rule is if you select an unconventional approach to doing the method. If this is the case, be sure to explain why this approach was used and how it enhances the overall research process. So, for example, if you're talking about, say, the pulse, if you're trying to evaluate the pulse, increase in pulse of a person after exercise. You do not need to go into the details of I took 3 fingers, went to the radial artery and pressed it till I was able to feel the pulse. I used a watch to. So people understand how exactly, because people you are reading are from the biomedical field, so you don't need to go into unnecessary detail of basic simple procedure like how I took a BP, I tied the cuff around a person's left arm or right arm, and then I asked them to lie down, and then that's not something you need to do. You essentially just say, I used a BP monitor. You can maybe mention the company of a BP monitor, which is also usually not necessary. But unless it's an unconventional approach where you ask someone to hang upside down and then you took the BP, that would be important whether you took it in the legs, took it in the arms, etc. But if you have used conventional accepted approaches of a particular way of doing things, then you do not need to go into unnecessary details of these basic procedures, right? Do not uh, get involved in problem blindness. It's almost a given that you will encounter problems when collecting your or generating your data. Do not ignore these problems or pretend that they did not occur. Often documenting how you overcame obstacles can form an interesting part of the methodology. It demonstrates to the reader that you can provide a cogent rationale for your decisions you made to minimize the impact of any problems that arose. So say you had trouble reaching um, a lot of the study participants because their phone numbers were off. And some would say, oh, no, I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say I had only 30 people and I called 30 people, all answered. But it is important that you are not suffering from problem blindness. You mentioned that a lot of people did not have their phones or did not answer our phones or changed their number, was coming unavailable, because that itself proves to be an important result of the methodology that you applied. So you should include what problems you faced maybe in the results section or the methods section, but don't become problem blind and don't try to portray as if everything was hunky dory, because everyone faces problems while collecting or generating their data, and everyone understands that unless there are major flaws with collection where you have falsified data and added information about people that don't exist, etc., uh, make sure that you are not suffering from problem blindness and you include information that would possibly help other people when they're recreating the study, right? And just as the literature review section of your paper provides an overview of sources you have examined while researching a particular topic, the methodology section should cite any sources that informed your choice and application of a particular method. That is, a choice of a survey should include any citations to the works you used to help construct the survey. So, for example, if you have identified certain questions from certain articles, or if you are following the same procedures that a particular person has published before, or if you are, say, doing a particular surgery that someone has already done before, you make sure you cite their works. You don't try to portray everything as if it's original from you. Um, so it really helps someone understand that this is an established method of doing things as it has already been published, and therefore you are trying to replicate them, not and that'll basically help give a little more strength to your methodology section instead of you trying to plagiarize and not giving people credit for what they have already done, right? So a description of a research studies method should not be confused with a description of the sources of information. Such a list of sources is useful in itself, especially if it's accompanied by an explanation about the selection and use of these sources, right? So I think that's enough about the method section of an article. Let's move on to the results section that you would be writing next. The purpose of this section is to identify the data you obtained from your experimentation and use only data that you consider central to your study. There is no need to mention the demographic details, as this can be mentioned in a separate table. As I mentioned yesterday, the table number 1 is usually for a number of male, number of female, number of people who suffered from comorbidities, etc., where it's easy to read, where someone can just go on the table and easily get information that they need instead of numbers being in a paragraph format, um, which becomes quite hard to read, quite boring to read. If you see a lot of numbers, they don't go in your head immediately. So it's better to include this information in the first table of your article. And do not go on and on with information in the form of numbers. Keep the results of the same type together. Consider you're studying the use of a particular plate or a screw or an implant in orthopedics, and you have different cohorts. You have young patients, you have old patients. It would be smart to keep the results of each subgroup together. Or if you are comparing the effect of a drug in a case and a control group, keep the results of the case group together and the control group together, right? And you should present the data uh, only essential to your article. Secondary importance should be in supplementary materials sections. The supplementary materials section where you can add information that's not super exciting or that's not the main part of what your aims and objectives of the article were. So your result section is succinct. It's not too number heavy, and you are just driving out points that you have information that you have received from your data, and not harping on about uh, stuff that is irrelevant to your aims and objectives, right? So this is an example of something that I had written a while ago, where I was asked to present the results section um, for this particular cohort of patients. And you guys tell me if you think that this is an appropriate representation of how someone should write the article. I mean, it's full of numbers that could be better represented in a table or in a chart, where if you go through the whole paragraph, you'd be confused about what you read where, and it's not really giving out any information. If someone is reading it, I would have to sit and analyze exactly what this person is trying to say, and that's what makes it a very poor results section, because it's not giving a reader succinct, number free or less numbered information that he can retain, and at the end of the article can maybe reproduce in his own article, right? And then some tips for the results section. For example, you may have noticed an unusual correlation between two variables during the analysis of your findings. It's correct to point this out in the results section. However, speculating as to why this correlation exists and offering a hypothesis is belongs to the discussion of section of your paper. So for example, if you have uh, in your paper you have discovered a negative correlation between smoking and lung cancer, which means that the more the person smokes, the less chances of them having lung cancer is. So you just mention this in your results section, but don't go on to um, identify why this may have happened in your patient population. The results section are for just cold, hard facts, not opinions, not arguments. So you represent what cold, hard facts you have gotten from your data. And then if you want to, the whole point of the discussion section is to discuss the results that you have obtained. And that's where you will present any sort of explanations, any sort of previous studies that have been done that have shown this correlation or not, right? And uh, you need to so that's something that you can't do, where you present a result followed by a short explanation of the findings. Is not Doesn't mean explain them by giving some opinions or giving some arguments related to them. Explanation of findings includes just the cold hard facts that you have gotten about that from your data, right? And I would include the tables and graphs in sort of the results section, because although this is something that we write first, it's very important to represent data and in tables and graphs. So what the first thing I would say is never repeat data which is in text with graphs and tables. So if you have written something in the results section, don't write it again in a table or in a graph format just because it looks cool, or it provides no new information. Don't do that. Either include it in your text and you can just say um, whatever you need to say in your text, or have a table and reference that table in your text. So you can say that information about the demographic details of the patient can be found in of the patients can be found in table 1 or table 2, etc. So that's how you prevent duplicating your own results twice, and because a person who's reading your paper usually has very less time, and you don't want to waste their time with tables and results showing the same thing. Um, so make it easier for reviewers and readers to read through your document. Don't make your result section very number heavy. Try to make your data be coalesced in your graphs or in your tables as much as possible. However, if it's not possible, obviously you can include it in your result section. You need to show precise numerical values in your graphs and tables, uh, and the presence or absence of specific characteristics. Um, but we will talk about when to use tables, when to use graphs, what is the difference between them. Um, so when to skip tables and graphs is when there is no complicated or extensive data. Usually the rule of thumb is that whenever you're creating a table less than 2 by 2, you should not include it in the table format. You should instead include it in your results section in the text format. And if the data you are planning to present is secondary to the main data, include it in the supplementary materials instead of including it as a major table or a major graph, because usually journals have a restriction on the number of tables that they allow or the number of figures that they allow. So make sure that the tables that you have used are appropriate enough, are important enough to be included as a table and not just for show. So understanding this, this is an example of two tables that I have created. And I want you guys to tell me whether they deserve to be in a table format or not. Yeah, so a couple of you have answered no, so that makes absolute perfect sense, because as I mentioned, a 2 by 2 or less table has no reason being in a table format. You can include it in your results section itself, but however, just because someone wants to include tables, I have seen people include them in their articles, and then I have to go back to them and tell them, hey, this is not something that you should do. So only if your data is complicated enough, include it in your table or graph format and not in the results format, not in the results section. And the do nots of the results section: do not discuss or interpret your results. Save all this for the next section of your paper, which is the discussion section. Although where appropriate, you should compare or contrast specific results to those found in other studies, which would again be done in the discussion section. You need to report background information or attempt. Do not report background information or attempt to explain your findings again. Do not say, okay, this is the same thing that was found in this previous study. Have that in the discussion section. The results section is only for you. Usually there are no references in the results section. It's only based on the data that you have received, what your statistical package or your statistician is telling you. Do not include some raw data where you're saying patient 1 had 120 BP, patient 2 had 240 BP, patient 3 had 120 BP. So don't include raw data. Try to include means or a class interval or medians or modes or whatever the best way to represent your data is. And don't have intermediate calculations where, okay, we calculated this, then we calculated that. Say that all for the methods section. If you have actually some complex ratios that you have derived from your from the particular findings that you've gotten, describe those ratios in the methods section. In the results section, only write what your results are, right? And don't use phrases that are vague, appear to be greater than, or demonstrates promising trends. Either in the results section, either something is significant statistically or it isn't. So if your BP of your women is, say, your females BP, if you're taking an average mean of BP in a particular population, if the BP in your females is 120 by 80 and in the males is 130 by, say, 90, Don't write that the VP in males appeared to be greater than females. It was greater, right? You were writing the values there. It was greater. It didn't appear to be greater, right? So don't. Some people usually have this misconception of using research paper words. Um, that's absolutely not true. That's not some vocabulary that exists. You should use as simple language as possible. There is nothing like a sentence that belongs in a research paper. You can use your everyday language in a research paper so that it's the easiest for a reader to understand. Obviously, you will have some scientific words, some scientific phrases that you'll have to use, but there is no appropriate research paper language that you need to use in your paper. You can use everyday simple words, right? And don't repeat the same data more than once, even if you have found a negative correlation between smoking and lung cancer. Don't write it more than once in your results section. You can discuss it a lot in your discussion section if you want, but try not to say, okay, we found that smoking and lung cancer were not related. To conclude, smoking and lung cancer were not related. So don't write your results section like that, where you are repeating the same data more than once, no matter how earth-shattering or groundbreaking it may be. Keep your results section limited to what information you have found in a very objective way, no subjective inferences, etc. No interpreting your results, no providing any background information or trying to discuss what you have found, because all this will be done in the discussion section. It's often considered the most important part of your research paper. I would say that it's even more important than your results section, because it most effectively demonstrates your ability as a researcher to think critically about an issue, to develop creative solutions to problems based on your findings, and to formulate a deeper, more profound understanding of the research problem that you are studying. The discussion section is where you explore the underlying meaning of your research, its possible implications in other areas of study, and the possible improvements that can be made in order to further develop the concerns of your research. So the discussion section is where you are placing your research in the background of research that has been done, and what steps should be taken based on the findings or based on the results of your research, and where people should take new research forward. So it essentially becomes one of the most important sections, because here you can have creative solutions to your problems, like I spoke about yesterday or day before, where I said that we were trying to call patients, relatives who were suffering, relatives who were suffering with clubfoot, and we just were not able to reach about 50% of them because their numbers changed, right? So this is where we mentioned in our discussion section that one possible solution would be taking 2 or 3 numbers of their relatives when they come in for an appointment, so that you're not losing them for future follow up or for future contact, right? So here you can identify the issues that your article is addressing, what the previous studies were, how really your article is trying to change things, what all things would you change based on your results, and essentially it gives you a foray into answering your uh, problems with some creative solutions. Okay, and this is the section basically where you need to present the importance of your study and how it may be able to contribute or fill existing gaps in the field. If appropriate, the discussion section is also where you state how the findings from your study revealed new gaps in literature that had not been previously exposed or adequately described. So if you have found something that has not been described before, that's something novel, that's something new, and you can identify that and say that, okay, hey, this, we could not find a paper that has discussed this, and this is something that's an interesting association or correlation between these two things, and that's what we are presenting here today. And that's what, so this part of the paper is not strictly governed by objective reporting of information like the results section, where you have to have numbers and cold hard facts. It's where you can engage in creative thinking about issues, your evidence-based interpretation of findings, about issues through your evidence-based interpretation of findings. This is where you infuse your results with meaning. So while your results section is about objectiveness, is about cold hard facts, here is where you can apply those cold hard facts in the real world, depending on what has been done before, what is new, and how it's going to change people work in that particular field. Yeah. So the general rules of writing your discussion or any part of the paper is be concise and make your points clearly. Uh, do not be competitive saying that another article found this, but we have found this. They have only 40 people, we have 500 people. That's not going to help you. Just represent your findings based on what has been done before. And if your findings are um, showing something the same that other research has shown before, then report that as well. Or if it's completely contradicting something else, then report that as well. But do not get into a competitive spirit where, although they showed the same things, they had only 40 people, but we have 400 people, so our results make more meaning or have more sense. There's no need for that in the research world. Avoid using jargon. Um, so avoid making weird acronyms. Avoid making, like research paper language that I mentioned, where you have extensively complicated scientific words that you have brought out of your thesaurus. And because it has to be easy for a person to read. If a person is trying to read your research paper and he has to Google search every other word that you have included in your discussion, that person is most likely not going to accept your or not going to read further and not going to cite your article, which is an important aspect of the research um, of academics. So avoid using any jargon and follow a logical stream of thought where the results that you have presented first should have uh, been included in the discussion first, and therefore you have a logical stream of thought, and where you go from the problem that you are describing to your results and how they are placed, and then to um, what sort of recommendations you are giving or what sort of solutions you are giving to the problems that your research has identified. Um, Again, if need be, use subheadings to uh, organize your discussion or organize your results section like we did with the methods section. Um, there is no rule against doing this in a lot of different journals, so don't be scared of doing that if it helps you yourself um, organize things and write everything in a systematic manner. So what the discussion essentially has is the explanation of the results, comment on whether or not the results were expected, the results you received were expected, and present any explanation for the results. Go into greater depth when explaining findings that were unexpected or especially profound. If appropriate, note any unusual or unanticipated patterns or trends that emerge from your results and explain their meaning. So, for example, if you have some male participants and some female participants, and you say the risk of lung cancer in males was found to be 50x or 100x. However, this finding could possibly be explained by the fact that the smoking prevalence in males was 30x, etc. So if you have something unusual or if you have a finding that you did not anticipate, try to um, guesstimate how you have come that you have received that result, and what are the factors that led you to finding that result, right? It may not be 100% because of that, but you can try to explain them, because this is not, again, not an objective part of your research paper. But you cannot give explanations like because they had more water, that's why they got more lung cancer, right? The explanation should be scientifically sound, and you should note, maybe reference other papers that say, okay, smoking is associated with lung cancer. That's why the men who suffered from 50x from lung cancer were smokers, and that's why maybe they had lung cancer, right? So just because it's not an objective part doesn't mean that you can let your imagination run completely wild. Make sure that what you are saying has scientific basis. Reference other articles that have shown the information that you're trying to present. And after you have explained your results, you need to reference the previous research, compare your results with the findings from other studies, or use studies to support a claim. If you're trying to say that an apple a day causes colon cancer, then if there are other studies that have proven this, no matter how small, try to find them, try to cite them, and but before citing them, make sure that they have appropriate methodology, and then use them to support your claim or use them to refute a claim um, uh, where if an article has found that apples a day have not kept the doctor away, you can say that, however, we found this result, and therefore the question of apples causing colon cancer is muddy, etc. So that's what something you can do is where when you reference to previous researchers, then you can deduce basically a claim for how the results can be applied more generally. For example, you can describe the lessons learned while doing the study. You can propose recommendations that help improve a problem or improve a situation that you have found in your while conducting your study, or the results from your study that point to a particular problem. If, for example, if you're conducting a survey of orthopedic surgeons, and they say that if the current guideline says that, for just for example, if the current guideline says that if you have to use a CT scan for every fracture femur, right? Then if you have a survey where you asked orthopedic surgeons what is the most common methodology you use, and if they have said X-rays, then you can help recommend some strategies where you have online conferences more regularly, or if you have radiologists uh, suggest some test to the orthopedics instead of them suggesting, and vice versa. Then you can have some recommendation that you can have for improving the situation that exists today, or you can recommend some best practices where you have evaluated, say you are trying to see which sort of surgery is best for, say, liver cancer, whether it's removing half the liver, one third of a liver, particular sections of liver based on where it is. So then you're trying to identify what the best practices is, which method yielded the best results, and that's when you're trying to make that deduction and trying to have some recommendations for people that are reading it. And you can also include a hypothesis and basically a more general claim or possible conclusion arising from your results, right? So this is the basic content of what a discussion should have, and this is the basic organization where you have link your findings to literature, then theory, and then practice. So first you need to do is reference other articles and say what they are saying, what was said before, what's new about it. Then you move on to how the theory of things that you have researched is changing and how people can apply it in practice, right? Begin by briefly restating the research problem and answering all of the research questions underpinning the problem that you posed in the introduction. So your introduction section, which you will write after this, will, when you set out, you would have some aims and objectives that you set out with in this while writing while conducting this whole study. So try to answer all the aims and objectives, whether the aims were met or not, why were they not met, how were they met, what results you got from it, etc. So try basically answering all those questions in the discussion section. So you have essentially answered all the questions that you set out with. And then include any analysis of any unexpected findings. Try to find some papers who have similar findings, or try to find papers who don't have similar findings, and try to explain if there is any problem with your methodology because of which you have found this. So there's no shame in that. You have to always include potential limitations and weaknesses of your studies. So if you're trying to conduct a study on, say, obesity in Mumbai, and if you have a very small sample size, you can mention that the limitations of the study is the sample size. However, because we used a particular scale that is very accurate, or some other reason that you have come up with, this is why the study is strong. So always mention your limitations and weaknesses while you are writing your discussion, because it helps the reader or the editor also to know that this person understands where it's weak, but he also understands where it's strong, right? That helps you get, instead of you saying, "Ha, my best too, I'm the best, my paper's the best, I'm gonna get this prize or whatever." Make sure you identify your limitations and weaknesses so you don't look like a an egomaniac when it comes to representing your research. Some don'ts of discussion: don't waste entire sentences restating your results. You can just, although it may be something that either cured a cancer that you discovered, don't restate your results because you've already mentioned them in the results section. Instead, discuss your results, discuss what the implications are, what previous research says, what you are trying to say, etc. And do not introduce new results in discussion. All objective results that you found from your data that you want to include in your article have to be in the results section, and the discussion section is a discussion of the results section. So you can't introduce new results in the discussion. For example, even if you have something minor as only 23 females were smokers, and you've not introduced it in your results section, then do that instead of having new results pop up in your discussion, because that's going to leave people confused. So after you've written the methods, the discussion, the results, you can move on to the conclusion, which is basically presenting the last word on the issues you raised in your paper. Just as the introduction gives a first impression to your reader, the conclusion offers a chance to leave a lasting impression. Do this, for example, by highlighting key points in your analysis or findings. Summarize your thoughts and convey a larger implication of your study. The conclusion is an opportunity to basically answer the question, so what? By placing the study within the context of past research about the topic you've investigated. So with the conclusion, you are basically answering the question, so what? So what do I do with the results that I have found here? How does it change my life? How does it change the life of people who are practicing this specialization? And that's what you need to include in your conclusion section. It should answer the question, so what? You need to demonstrate the importance of your ideas. Don't be shy. The conclusion offers you a chance to elaborate on the significance of your findings. You can introduce possible new or unexpected or expanded ways of thinking about the research problem. This does not refer to introducing new information, which should be avoided, but to offer new insight and creative approaches for framing the research problem based on the results of your study. So you can maybe say that I conducted this study this way, but there should be a randomized control trial between, say, eating apples and colon cancer, because I have found in my small study that there is a correlation. So there has to be a randomized control trial to determine for the greater good whether or not this correlation actually exists or not. So this is where you can add information about what needs to be done next, how this is changing a physician's life, and how you should essentially leave a lasting impression on your readers. In the conclusion, the rules to follow are simple. You can use clear, simple language. Don't reiterate your results and discussions again. This is a chance for you to answer the question, so what, and talk about how it's going to change that physician's life or change that physician's practice, and indicate any opportunities for future research. How to make your conclusion section even stronger is, if it's a contemporary problem like obesity, warn of any consequences if you don't attend to it. So for example, if you have found some association between obesity and coronary artery disease, then you can warn of consequences in the last thing. So when a doctor is reading it, he may be inclined to warn his patients of these same consequences. You can recommend any specific courses of action for a physician if there is a patient sitting in front of him having a similar sort of presentation, and that patient would be benefited, say, from a therapy that you have introduced in your research. Then you can recommend specific courses of action. Or if you're talking about a diagnostic model where you are trying to see whether a CT scan should be done before an X-ray, or sort of a CT scan should be done before an MRI, or vice versa. If someone's come with a head injury, then you can recommend specific courses of action, saying that although yes, MRI takes more time, but overall it increases. This is just hypothetical, by the way. Overall, it increases the chance of survival of a patient, etc. And you can restate key statistics or facts However, don't try to repeat your results. Only the key statistics or key facts that you have obtained from the results. And you can return to an anecdote in your introduction. That's not something that you need to do. However, it can make your conclusion a little stronger, and you can definitely provide a take-home message to help the reader remember your study. And then you move on to the introduction section, where you're basically providing a brief context to the readers. You are saying what the problem is, okay, why you came up with this topic essentially. What you can ask yourself while writing this introduction section is, what was I studying? Why was this topic important to investigate? What did we know about this topic before I did this study? And how will this study advance our knowledge, right? So you should ask what you were studying. Why was this topic important to investigate? What was I studying? Was they say something like colon cancer, or if it's something like um, anything or obesity, right? You were basically studying that, what it refers to. If you're studying adult spinal deformity, what exactly the pathology is. Why was this topic important to investigate? What the current, if there are some 50,000 people suffering from it, and the current treatment of it is very poor, and the results are very poor. So we decided to do this special implant or this special surgery to see if results are better. Uh, and that's how it'll advance our knowledge by showing us that there may be alternative ways to do this surgery, etc. So this is just, again, just an example, but this is the way your introduction should flow. What you were studying, why was this topic important, what did you know about this topic before you did this study, what are some gaps in the knowledge that are there, how you're trying to fill those gaps. That's essentially what the introduction section is. The general phases are it's establish essentially an area to research. This is a general phase on how to um, start your research. Is establish an area to research, identify research needs. For example, in orthopedics, then you go to hip replacement, then place your research within the research niche. Is DHS is an implant that's used, and it should be actually be THR. But is DHS better than THR? THR is again total hip replacement, and you can identify it that way. Then you can establish the limitations of your study. You can state your aims and objectives, your research questions, any variables of interest, and any methods of investigation that you have. So this is a general phase of how you should move on with your study, with your introduction section, so that people understand exactly what you are referring to, what the current knowledge is, etc. Some tips is avoid the dictionary introduction while using this. So this again is not an essay. It's not a blog article. It's a research article. So don't say Merriam-Webster or Oxford Dictionary defines orthopedics as the study of blah blah blah. It's advisable not to do that. You should use specific information that you have received from previous articles, like adult spinal deformity refers to, say, a Cobb angle of more than 10, and is people with sorry, so and so million people are suffering from it every year. And then you need to provide a reference to an article which sort of seconds this fact that you have written. Because as I said, it's a research article. You have to provide references for any statement of fact that you make. So if you say that, you can't say that a lot of people are suffering from TB in India. Even if you do, you have to mention an article that says so, where they're talking about maybe the prevalence of TB in India. So instead of saying a lot of people, find a paper which gives you an approximate number and say this many people, which is that dash percent of the population of India suffering from TB. The current investigations in TB are so and so. What we are trying to do is establish a new, and how those investigations are poor, how they're leading to decreased detection rates. So what we are trying to do is establish a new diagnostic technique, which would improve the detection of TB, which would improve lifespan of TB people, decrease the prevalence or incidence of a disease, etc. So that's how your introduction should flow, where you're talking about a general topic, move on to more specific things, move on to previous research, move on to previous research done in that particular section, say if it's diagnostic modalities for TB, what the gaps are, then move on to what you are talking about, how it fills those gaps, right? Then let's move on to titles. So readers decide if the article is relevant to them or not, just by reading the title sometimes, because as you guys might have remembered from the results section of the PubMed or of Google Scholar that we saw yesterday, the first thing that we see is the title, and then we decide, okay, maybe this is important for me to read. And the more number of readers you have, the more citations you have, and that's what's important in the end. So you need to have an effective title. Actually, there are more than 10 papers published just on what makes an effective research title, where they have analyzed a number of titles and they've seen that if a title has so many, so and so words, then there is more chance of it being cited, or if there are more than 10 words, then there's less chance of it being cited, etc. So there are actually articles done on whether or not on what makes a title effective, right? So some tips for effective titles is you need to attract attention, not say we found the cure to cancer or something like that, but just appropriate enough where you're just hinting them about what your study is about, but not giving out the results completely, because if they just have the results right there in the title itself, they won't bother reading through the abstract or the results or the whole paper that you have. So make sure that you don't you have effective titles in the way that you are trying to attract a little bit of attention. Use the fewest possible words. Don't go on to include 15 or 20 words. Have the fewest possible words so it's easy to read. People are understanding what you're talking about, what topic it is. You don't need to include exact information about your study participants unless it's relevant to that particular topic. Make it informative, but make it concise, and identify the main issue you're talking about. So if you're talking about the diagnostic modality in, say, TB, my title would probably be, does this new diagnostic modality for TB increase the detection rate or decrease the lead time, etc. So that is posed as a question, which a person would have to go on the link and read the abstract to answer. So that makes an effective title where I'm exactly telling them what this is about. It's a new diagnostic modality for TB, which may be better than the ones that currently exist, right? So like I mentioned, there are a few studies done on just on whether a title is effective or not. And these are some of them that are there. So they have found multitude of different results in their study. So there is no actual consensus on what makes a great title. But they have just observed some trends saying that there's a huge increase in number of titles with question marks, or lengths of titles vary according to individual sciences. Where biology has 15, maths 8, etc. But you can definitely read them in your free time and determine which article is best for you to determine what article title you want in your studies. But there have been some studies on this. So this is quite a contentious topic, and this has been discussed quite a lot in the research fraternity. So there is no ideal title, but you can just give tips on how to write a title. So there are actually 13 different types of articles, article titles, according to this person called Dr. Hartley, who has done a lot of research on titles of articles. There are descriptive titles, declarative titles, and questions, which are the main three. And there is a short checklist for appropriate article titles where it shouldn't be too short, shouldn't be too long, it should be clear, not have many technical words, and it should not have any uncommon abbreviations like, say, TBD. If you're using TBD instead of TB, where you're saying TB disease, and that would make no sense to a person who's reading that title. Maybe he would just let that article go before reading it. So these are some short questions that your title should answer, where it can be a pun or irony. Like we have an article that's going to be published with PubGeek, and the name is "Why My Hip Was Missed," or "Who Missed My Hip." where we're basically trying to identify what the cause of a missed congenital or a developmental hip dysplasia is. Uh, so that's what. So it can be a little pun and irony, but it's not going to go into the journalism level. But make sure that your title, when you're writing, answer these few questions. You can. So now you have completed your article. You could now you have to decide who has to be the author. So usually this causes a lot of fights between researchers, causes a lot of fights between medical students. However, it should genuinely not, because my rule of thumb is that the first three authors are usually ones who have provided. That's my understanding, is the first three authors are usually the ones that are provided most information and most help from for the article. So usually the first author is a person who conducts or supervises the data collection, does the analysis or presents the analysis, makes the presentations, writes a major chunk of the article, interprets the results, and puts the paper together for submission. So the corresponding author then is not compulsorily to have the first author. It's not compulsory for the corresponding author to be the first author, but it should be a person who can answer any and all questions about the study if contacted in the future. Usually, it's a senior faculty at the institution. So don't try to think that, oh, I want to be corresponding author, my name, number, everything will be on the paper. People will think that, oh, I'm such a great guy, I'm the corresponding author, I've really done a lot for this paper. Generally, that's not the case. A corresponding author, if you are writing a paper about medulloblastomas, and if you are contacted in the future by person who's read your study, or if you're contacted by a journal later, if a person who's read your study, you will not have any idea about the nitty-gritty of that particular pathology, right? So it makes sense for a corresponding author to answer all the questions that are presented to him by researchers, even if it's in the future, because he has the most understanding of that particular pathology. He is the person who's done the surgeries. You won't be able to answer any questions regarding those surgeries, right? It'd be like taking a viva of someone who doesn't know anything. So don't vie or don't cry to be a corresponding author. It's okay. The corresponding author should genuinely be the person who can correctly identify can correctly answer any problems that someone poses by emailing them or messaging them, etc. Right? A ghost author is something called excluding someone who's participated in the work. So again, I would recommend not doing that. So before you start working with your colleagues, make sure that there is a clear understanding of who's going to be first author, second author, third author, so that there are no fights in the future. There's no harm in discussing it first instead of fighting later after the paper has been made and the person who has access to the paper publishes it, then someone else publishes it somewhere else, then you all get caught for some sort of copyright violation because the journal has two journals have published this same article. So make sure you all just discuss in brief what the authorship status is going to be. It doesn't matter if you're first, second, or third. As a medical student, doesn't even matter if you're sixth. I have been sixth author in some cases, and I'm proud to be on those papers because they're generally good papers. So don't worry about your authorship status now. However, don't let it go if you have done the most work. Make sure people know it and make sure that you are saying I have done the most work and that's why I would like to be first author. But don't fight and quibble about first author, second author, third author, because that's not our place right now as medical students to do that. We should just be happy with writing a few papers of our own and being on the authors list. And nowadays, journals will ask what part of the article preparation or research work each author has participated in. So there will be a checklist where you say participate in the data collection, data analysis, statistics, or writing the paper, etc. So make sure you have appropriate ticked for each author that has contributed to this. So if there are any questions that arise, they could be directed to that particular person instead of having a havoc later on. But yeah, so determine your authorship early on. Make sure that everyone knows what they're working for. It would be unfair to exclude someone who has really worked hard on the paper, and at the same time, it would be unfair to include someone who has not worked at all on the paper. And that's called gift authorship, where people just keep including each other in their papers, and they provide authorship that way. So I would say exclude doing gift authorship because you are responsible for everything that paper is written. So as an author, you are responsible for all claims and comments that paper has made. So I would say avoid doing that. After that, you've done that. There are some keywords that you have to include in your article submission. Uh, you can use the same mesh keywords that we had searched for yesterday. You can have only established abbreviations like DNA, RNA, MRI, etc. You can again make up your own. You can't make up your own abbreviations when you're using this. And then you can go on to write your abstract, which is usually, like I said, the most important part of your research papers. It's especially the most read part of your research paper. So make sure it is well done. It meets the guidelines of the journal that you're trying to submit in. Some journals will have something called a structured abstract, where they want within the 250 or 300 word abstract, they want background, methods, results, etc. So make sure you have that down, because otherwise you'll have to start working on your abstract again. It's usually the last element to be written, but the first one to be read and the most read part of your paper. And usually only the title and abstract will always be freely available, whether it's on PubMed, whether it's on a paid site, whether or not it's open access. So make sure these two things you have honed down. A good abstract leads to an interested reader, leads to more citations, because citations is the name of the game and not the number of research papers that you have. So make sure that you have those two things honed down. So how do you write an abstract is always check your guide for authors, read it 2-3 times before starting to write anything. Um, this guide to authors will be available again on your journal website. It will be under information to authors or guide to authors, where they write exactly what they need. And if you don't submit it that way, then they're going to send it back to you. It will cause unnecessarily delay in your article submission process, which we don't want. Once you have done that, determine your abstract length. Usually it's 200 to 250 words. Um, make it concise, avoid any descriptive sentences, because you have only 200 to 50 words to write everything from introduction to your conclusion, usually if it's a structured abstract. So avoid any descriptive sentences. Don't include all your results, include only the results that you find important, that you think are the major chunk or the most important part of your paper, so that someone who reads it thinks that, oh wow, okay, this paper has this information, I want to access it, I want to read it further, and maybe he'll reference you then and have give you a citation. Be very clear about your study purpose. Describe this purpose in very short, maybe a sentence or two. Answer the question, what is the purpose of my research and why should the readers care about it? If you're describing any new research methods or results, it's important to describe it within the context of your study. Consider thinking about why you found your research interesting and why did you decide to study the topic, and then you have the answer to why should people care about my research and what's new about it. When you're writing about the methodology in the abstract, just write about how you decided to solve the problem. What exactly did you do to reach your results? Then you can mention your findings, include any answer to the problems you set out with in the first part of your abstract. If it should not usually be a vague sentence where you say a large percentage of schools in India are found to be negligent in offering sufficient midday lunch meals. It does not add any real value to the reader. Instead, say 64% of schools in India are found to be negligent in offering midday lunch meals, right? This would give the reader more information about exactly how many schools are involved with this and are negligent, instead of you just saying a large percentage, right? So be in the results section of the abstract as well. Be objective. Don't write any explanations or just provide hard facts and hard data. And how to fine tune your abstract is do a proofread and edit. Look at every single word. Leave it for a day or two, I would suggest, and come back to it, because sometimes we too suffer from writer's block. If you leave it for a day or two and come back to it, you think, okay, maybe this sentence is unnecessary, I'll remove it, add this one, because you are working in a frame of just 200 words. So it becomes very important to edit, re-edit, and just take a break from it, from your just for the sake of your brain, and come back to it, so that you have develop new ideas, you develop a better understanding of your own paper, and you can then write it, then pass it to 2-3 colleagues, and they can say, okay, hey, I didn't find this information useful, maybe you can delete it from your abstract, and you can add something else that might have been important in your results. Avoid any background information. There are no references in abstract, so you don't need to reference another article that says a particular thing. um, don't don't end with a dot 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 like we do in messages today. It's just a general uh, general thing I would like to say. And avoid any abbreviations or jargons or terms that may be confusing to the reader, because you understand that if someone is just reading your title and abstract, that person does not have enough time to think about what you mean, because you're using some complicated words that you got from your thesaurus. And you're not allowed again to have any images or illustrations or tables or references to the abstract. So make sure you have that in mind before you start writing it. Just the last few points before Dr. Rujuta joins us. She's already joined us, so I'm just gonna hurry up here. The manuscript language needs to be simple. Convey one piece of information per sentence. Write direct, short, and factual sentences. Um, Present tense is for known facts. So, for example, the average life of a honeybee is 6 weeks, and if you have done the experiment and you have found the results, then you can say that the average lifespan of a bee in our contained environment was 6 weeks. So this is just some nuances of the usual present past tense that you need to use while writing your paper. And while writing your paper, make sure that the grammar you have is an active voice. So instead of saying that the lifespan of a bee increase is what we found, you could say we found that the lifespan of a bee increased, because that active voice usually makes your sentences shorter, and it helps you to avoid jargon. So like I said, there is no research sentences or research words that you can use. So just make your paper as simple as possible. Remember NUAP, which means that no unnecessary acronyms. Please don't make your own acronyms that aren't known by most people, because it just becomes confusing to use those, and just for someone who's reading the paper to go back and see, oh, this is what they meant with this acronym, and it just messes with their train of thought. Eliminate any redundant phrases. Don't use isn't, weren't, aren't, your. Try to avoid using these apostrophe words, because they're usually not part of the research world. And always remember to check yourself before you wreck yourself. Try to go back, read your paper again and again before you submit it, because unless you do, reviews are going to come back to you with those same questions, which will again delay your time for publishing. So definitely go back, send it to a few colleagues, and then publish your paper. So I think that's my time for today about how to write your research paper. I think we're joined by Dr. Rujuta. Dr. Rujuta, are you online? Hello, ma'am. How are you?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So nice to see a very animated Aniruddh explaining all about how to conduct research. And good to see such a lot of people interested in it. So I've been listening patiently. Go on.
It's a pleasure to have you, ma'am. Ma'am, so a couple of students had a few questions regarding the research world, and we know you've been involved with research for the past 20 years. You've been the president of the BOS and multiple other associations, and we thought you'd be the best person to
just vice president as of yet.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you for the prophecy, but
ma'am, so we thought you'd be the best person to answer any questions that these students have. So I think the IMA-MSN team has written some questions for you, and maybe Ms. Badin can take it from here.
Sure, I'll be happy to answer whatever I can.
Thank you, Dr. Aniruddh. Welcome, Dr. Rujuta, ma'am. Ma'am, we have a few questions that basically we told our students today that Dr. Rujuta will be joining us, and they sent a few questions and we'd like you to answer them. Firstly, there's a question from a student. Let's suppose that I find a research which is maybe done in another state, and I like that research. Its methodology is also feasible for me to conduct. I search further and find that such a research has not been done in my state on that same topic.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like conducting it with the same methodology, but on a different population. So will that be considered as plagiarism?
So nowadays, it's a very good question, firstly. Nowadays, there are very, very strict norms for plagiarism. Somehow, we tend to take the easy way out. So what you could do is borrow the idea, but also take a little bit of homework there. Look at what aspect of the same research has not been addressed. For example, if you say IT fractures in this population age group, and you want to look at the outcomes, and you see that, okay, this particular implant is new and I've seen it in somewhere else, but I've not seen it in my state. Then what you could do is, along with the implant design, also study the fracture patterns, also study what comorbidities were there. So you add a new angle to it, then your study population changes. But if you're just going to mirror the same thing, then I think, you yourself deserve a little more credit than to just take the easy way out and change figures, numbers, and a few words here and there. That's like cheating yourself. So more than plagiarism, I think it will not serve the purpose if you really want to do good research.
So we must tweak the topic a little.
Yeah, as in, definitely there are so many aspects to be thought about. I mean, in India, I think a very important thing we have is the numbers. Second very important thing we have is a variety and the will. The problem is with the follow-up. So if you can kind of look at your own unique problems and find ways of solving them, then that really helps.
Now we have two questions on methodology. I'll pose the first one. It's a little descriptive actually. I submitted an abstract for the ICMR STS with a certain methodology and it was accepted. But then when I got down to data collection and analysis, I realized that my methodology is not feasible for me in the time and resources I have. So now can I change it? Will this cause a rejection of my paper as I changed my methodology midway? And is it ethical?
Yes, this will certainly cause a resubmission, because methodology, the soul of your paper is your material and methods. And that is something you have to, I think Aniruddh will agree, many times when we've interacted, we've kind of thrashed the same thing 10 times, and what to include, what not to include, which way to conduct the study. Most reviewers do realize that it's not possible to have a perfect sort of a study, but at least if you have taken the correct path, and as long as you've thought rationally about what question you're going to answer, and you've taken the pros and cons into account, plus with a very conscious, clear mention of what biases were there inherent in your study, then that is good enough and qualifies for a good research. But when you say it was not feasible at all, that means there is a basic problem in conducting the study. Then any review board, anybody will ask you to just resubmit. And you need to change tracks then before embarking on the journey, and that's very important. So should not feel disheartened with that. But if you realize that it is just not feasible, then that's in fact a good, we look at it as a good introspection. So we welcome that from students.
You're not wasted time doing half your study, then realizing the other half is.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
There's also another follow-up question on methodology. How to come up with an effective methodology that is feasible, and also how to determine it if I'm asking the right questions and choosing the right parameters so that I get the correct result.
Okay, so let's break this question into two parts. How to decide a good methodology. So as a general rough rule of the thumb, keep your focus as narrow as possible. Keep your study population as uncomplicated as possible. And when you are looking at a subject, first start the other way. Start with a good literature search so that you know what aspects are not addressed. Then you can jot down, okay, this is one part which has not been taken suitably. For example, like when he was saying that, bees or something he was saying. So then that time, if you say that, okay, bees are, the sting of a bee potentially causes an anaphylactic reaction. So then if you can't just generalize and say that I will study it in any age group. So then determine the species of the bee, determine the type of anaphylactic reaction you want to look at, and the time duration. So the minute you start putting in your check boxes that this is how much I'm going to look at, automatically it will be clearer to you what you want to study. And just come back to the second part of the question, repeat that.
How do I know that I'm asking the right question?
Right question.
The right parameters.
So for that, I think they must have, I'm not sure how much you have covered, but something of the null hypothesis, if you have already been through.
Yes, ma'am.
So you have to exactly go to the reverse. And once you have put the reverse question, you will automatically be able to generate answers to that. Let's assume that this is not true. And then you go about writing down your, I think it's a little abstract to keep talking like this about it, but if you have a specific topic, then automatically, I don't think any student is, unable to really frame a good research question. What I find most students struggling with is they lack absolute clarity and focus. They try to go all over the place. They want to have too many things included. And it's the typical Indian jugaad which we want. You want ye dil mange more. So for the price of one, you want two. So you have to really be meager in that, but be very clear and specific, because then you'll find that when you write down your study, it will be a very easy flowing read for the reviewer. And that will fetch you more. In fact, negative studies have great value. Most of us tend to think that the result must be positive and like the best results, and 80% of my population had great results or excellent outcomes. No, that not at all. Not at all. What we look for is, was the study well conducted? Was it honest enough? Were negative results really reported? And if so, were they analyzed properly? So that's all we really care about.
Right, absolutely.
Ma'am, there's another question. How to find opportunities to present papers in big conferences? Do we need to get invited, or do we approach through some channels? Also, is it necessary that the research is complete by the time we present the paper?
So let's go reverse in this question. Yes, it's certainly you should have, the research should have been complete. You should have had a minimum follow-up of say 2 years based on the condition that you're studying. Most of you would be in an institute, so you would have a PG guide, or you would have access to somewhere where you go for an externship or short duration sort of observerships. So you could pick up papers in collaboration with that department, and it must be submitted through that department. So if your title is really catchy, if your subject is really something new, then submitting through that, I don't think is a problem at all. And you must be members of some or the other association. So for example, you could be, if you're from Telangana, you must be a member of your state association. All associations have not a full membership after you qualify, but even in the PG stage, you can become an associate member. So you could definitely get your name in that. Whether we will be allowed to present will all depend on the local rules of every conference. Yeah. But if you really spend time on it, if you worked hard on it, you have a good follow-up. It depends on what condition you're studying. For example, if you're going to be doing a paper about pseudarthrosis tibia, that's a very, very rare condition. So even 7-8 cases with a reasonable long-term follow-up is good enough. Or a radial club hand, 8-10 cases good enough. But then if you're going to do a research about supracondylar fractures and the pin tract infections, for example, then a minimum of 100 to 200 have to be there. So what you choose and how common is the condition, that really matters.
And there's another question. If we are using any research papers in reference or citations, but we have not bought the paper, we got them by piracy, then will that be a problem while submitting?
Actually, I'm not really the best person to answer this one, but I don't think so, because I think nowadays there are such a lot of student resources which are free. And Google Scholar itself, then the title search, then sometimes you can put in the university and search, or you can put the author. or you can put the digital identifier number, DOI, or something like that. So there are so many ways of searching. So, and I believe there are some officially unofficial sites which hack also. So, I mean, they actually offer it to you. There are some drug companies which may have access to these. So where you sourced out your reference from, I don't think that's the reason for rejection at all.
There were a few questions on paper writing as well. While writing a research paper, what are some must-know tips we must follow to increase our chances of our paper being accepted by a publisher?
Okay, so number one must-know tip is you have to have a good statistician on board. Before you begin the study, you must sit down and plan it out with him. Because something that, it's like being on the same page. What I may think as a clinician is a good methodology may be absolutely the wrong way of representing things to the statistician. For example, if I'm saying septic hip and I want to write down everything about the baby's age group from say 6 months to 2 years, to me it's fine as long as I'm saying it's toddlers. But the statistician may say, no, you need to put it down in days because he needs comparable uniformity in the data. I can say I'll diagnose septic hip clinically, but he will say, no, where is the clear-cut data? What parameters did you use? What was the gold standard? So did you use ultrasound or did you use blood counts? So what kind of data, qualitative, quantitative, what you are using, what decimal points or what calibration you are using, all those things are important to run through him, and which tests he or she is going to be able to apply to your paper. So once that is clear, then you divide your groups, especially if you're going to have a control and a study population. If you're just going to have, I think, continuous data, then usually there won't be that kind of a thing. Then the randomization will matter. And depending on the ethics of your topic, whether randomization is possible or not possible. So I was on the IEC KEM and there was, I think, one huge discussion on an injection methodology where they said that they wanted to study a particular drug for stroke. And the ethics committee just wouldn't agree because they said, we will not let this pass. You cannot randomize in a situation where there is a patient who needs treatment for stroke. So there cannot be placebo treatment. So depending on what your subject is, again, that is important to put down, that is randomization going to work or no. And every study cannot be a level 1 study at all. So it's fine to have in your CV all kinds of study, level 1, level 2, level 3, 4, things like that. Ideally, it is randomized control trials. So if I give you a contemporary example, right now in the COVID scenario, so many liberties have been taken, Most of the times we would never publish a study unless you have a minimum 6-month data. But here in COVID, every 3 or 4 weeks, you find a new study coming out. And based on lab parameters, based on one drug versus the other. And they've even taken things like reduced hospitalization or reduced need for O2. So they've studied very finite criteria. So all sorts of things can happen, but if in true scientific rigor, the clearer your study population, the narrower your study question, the simpler and very tangible methods if you have with your outcomes, and good follow-ups. I think these 5 things are a must-have for a good, robust study in your population. I mean, in your CV.
Absolutely. Yeah, ma'am. So we as medical students usually don't have access to randomized clinical trials, and so that should not be the aim of what we want to do. We can start with maybe even a case report and then move on to a cohort or cross-sectional study. There's no harm in that.
You could start with simple anatomical parameters. See, if you look at implants in orthopedics, most of these companies are based on anthropometric parameters for, in the Western population. You could start a simple study on, say, the diameter of the radius versus the length of the radius in this particular age group for these kind of, where we'll see whether the screw length suffices or the plate So it's so simple. You have to base it on what you have in front of you and what is studyable. And if it's just an anatomy study, then you won't really need a very long follow-up either. But yeah, but you will need, in a cross-sectional study, you will need a larger population. So with everything that you choose, there will be, wheels within wheels.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you all a question? I think what kind of things have you all covered so far, and what is the main interest of the students these days?
Ma'am, so we have had most of our students who are online today are first and second MBBS. And so far we have covered everything from what is research, how to choose a research topic. Then we went on to see how you can go to PubMed and what's the best way to search on PubMed and Google Scholar is, and how you can get your papers that you want. Then today we spoke about, right before you joined us, we spoke about how to write a research paper. And before that, we had Dr. Parag Dumne from Leelavati speak about what are predatory journals. And, a lot of, because I'm sure you as well get tons of emails saying International Journal of Medical Research and Science, please, ma'am, please support us, please publish papers. So how medical students shouldn't get stuck in that loop of, publishing their hard worked papers in these predatory journals. So we've covered basics of essentially most of the things that we could for MBBS, and what I personally found of use during my MBBS career. But yeah, that's essentially what we have covered so far. As to what MBBS students are concerned with today, I'm sure Ms. Badin would be a better person to answer that.
No, I mean, honestly, through my experience, I never knew how to search an article in PubMed, to be very honest. I was that a novice as far as research is concerned. But then, all that the mesh terminology and PubMed lectures yesterday, and coming up with a topic that's actually feasible to pursue, all of that actually really enlightened me a lot. So I'm sure this will help me a lot when I pursue my next research topic. I actually had started one, but then it stopped midway because of COVID. It was a surgical topic, but then it kind of got stuck midway. So we are planning on pursuing it soon, but then I'm not sure what will happen.
So I just want to put this thought across to all of y'all, because of the good thing that y'all have done is touch upon predatory journals. So when you get a mail, or when it's too tempting, and if it's too easy to publish, and you see that the acceptance is just too high, or something is amiss, that suppose you have written one paper on, say, what were the commonest organisms in septic arthritis and osteomyelitis in a tertiary referral center. And then suddenly you get a mail saying that based on your fantastic work in genetics, and that title is quoted, we would like you to opine on this, and please submit your article about sports medicine. And then the third mail that you get after is this, based on your work on sports medicine. So it's just that if you respond to these emails, you realize that everything is disconnected there. So don't waste your time on all that as well. And since you were talking about how do I decide my study is feasible, try not to look at too much exotic a condition. Try not to include in your study, at least at MBBS level, something which is so rare that you may have full details about one patient of that nature. But it has, you to find another second or third case of that nature, it will take too long. And third, if your research is like absolutely very, very exotic, say like biomaterials or say, radioactive molecule, and it has no clinical implications, then chances are that you may still have a good paper, but you will not be able to get it through in a routine orthopedics journal. So then try to look for what journal would be more suitable to what you studied. So don't waste your effort. You could put it into a radiology journal. You could put it into a basic research journal. There are many ways, to kind of publish the same material, but in something with impact. Nowadays, IIT and technology, that's another area you all need to look into. They are very, very interested. And they may sometimes have these not fairs, but they hold these open forum kind of a thing where they are posing and they team up. So you have IIT students and medical students, and they throw open the clinical problem to you, and then you have to team up and come up with a solution. So even something as simple as that, you could develop an app for a particular problem, and that may suddenly, come up with a very, very good journal. You can submit it for patenting. You can submit it for industrial bench to, bedside. All so there's so many avenues actually if you want to collaborate, because technology is really the future. So that's again an aspect you all need to look into.
Ma'am, since we are discussing how to select journals to publish, I mean, I had this thought, and I want to know if it makes sense. For example, if I choose a topic, for example, something like effect of nail polish or mehendi on pulse oximeter, for example, and then I go out and I search on PubMed, and I find that there are a few journals that already have many articles on that particular topic. And then there are another set of journals that do not have many articles on that topic. So when I choose a journal, do you think it makes sense that we choose journals which do not have many articles on that topic, so that the chances of accepting my article getting accepted are high?
Yeah, that will be one important factor for sure, but also look at the impact factor of the journal itself.
Okay.
Look at the editorial board, look at the viewership, and look at what kind of people are contributing to it. Not just the rarity of the subject in that journal. Because otherwise you will have submitted, you will get a good acceptance, but if it has no value to your future career, then, I mean, if I get a student who applies to me for pediatric orthopedics, say as a fellow, but he submitted something in a dermatology journal, it automatically switches off my interest. So just because he's got an acceptance, so maintain a little bit of a path and a streamlined focus.
Right.
Ma'am, there was another student who wanted some elaboration on evidence-based medicine. Could you elaborate on the concept of it?
That's actually a huge topic in itself. If I had to put it in a nutshell, it's a bit of a two-edged sword. When we began practice, the concept of evidence-based medicine was still evolving. But the more you go in depth and the more studies you read and publish yourself, you realize that you can prove one theory with a study of 30 subjects, and you can go ahead and prove exactly the same thing with a study of 90 subjects. But something which has withstood the test of time, a procedure which has lasted long, a lot of review, something which has even gone into meta-analysis, something which has been adopted across the board. See, if you see a method which kind of goes, say, for example, the Ponseti technique for club feet. When that, it passes all the levels of peer review as well as clinical applicability, long-term follow-up, then that is kind of, that becomes a landmark paper. But you should, as a student, refrain from, so you should, the more you read, you'll be able to decipher which are the landmark milestone articles and which are, just changing the flavor every season. So you will realize that as you go along. But you should refrain from becoming, say, too dependent only on papers. There is always weightage to what is published as well as what is actually practiced. So techniques will keep evolving. The same procedure 10 years back maybe have been the latest thing in the market and like swept the whole practice guidelines. And then 10 years later, people say that this has very bad long-term complications. So there is always going to be things like spines, things like arthroplasty, where there is always a constant evolution of implants. There the evidence also keeps changing over the years. So it's good to have these 5 levels of publication, but you need to look at every aspect and then weigh the pros and cons and finally take home what is more relevant to you. So evidence-based medicines has a place. Eminence-based medicine is certainly not very popular, but clinical practice and things which have a gold standard, which have stood the test of time, I think nothing can replace that. Because finally, medicine is an art of a science. Remember that.
Ma'am, so I had a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No.
A lot of medical students do research only when they want to do USMLE or PLAB, or they want to, just get out of this country. So what do you think is the importance of research in the life of an Indian physician or an Indian resident?
So that's a very broad-based question, but we'll still try to answer it as simply as possible. When you're thrown into the sea, you will automatically learn to swim. So when you do all these things for going abroad, you will definitely add to your career. It will get you a placement somewhere. But when you go abroad, you will realize that every person sitting out there, if you have 10 papers, they have 20, somebody will have 15. So that's always going to be there. But if you have written up things which are really worth it. So when somebody looks at your CV, they should see a variety as far as a student is concerned. They should see some case series. They should see some case reports and long-term outcomes. So if you have, and possibly some basic research and some rare exotic conditions also. So if you have a good mixed bag for students who go abroad, it's very, very helpful. But when it comes to the Indian perspective, if you're going to live here, practice here, it will be important if you're going to seek placements for medical colleges or corporate hospitals. But it's not going to matter if you're going to do a largely private practice based, the typical GP or nursing home setup sort of a thing. In our free market economy, as I would call it, our Indian-based system is very, very still very much based on word of mouth. So to sharpen your skills, to refine your own self and do things better, yes, it will be important for personal growth. But in actual clinical day-to-day practice, if you're not going to indulge in corporate hospitals or have multiple attachments or medical college careers, then probably it may not be that's the only thing that defines you. You have to have clinical skills, PR skills, very important in today's world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but having research is good because you have an analytical thinking mind, and that definitely carries a good impression. But the patient who comes to you in private practice is just going to ask you one question: am I going to get better?
That's true.
Ma'am, actually, I had one question.
Sure.
Ma'am, you had just mentioned that a person who is trying to publish in pediatric orthopedics has submitted another article to dermatology. So that wouldn't be good for his career. But suppose there's a medical student, like suppose it's me. Actually, what happened is I am interested in general surgical research, but I wasn't getting so many opportunities in that particular field. So I tried to get into other fields as well. Like this year, COVID has affected like multiple organ systems. So I was trying to participate in a psychiatric psychology research, and so like will this affect my CV in the future?
So I'm not saying, so don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it is wrong to do it, but what we look for is your slow build up. So as a MBBS student, so we also look at that, at what stage you have published that. As an MBBS student, if you have a wide variety of subjects, they're absolutely fine. But once you're moving on to a fellowship, once you are applying as a senior registrar or a post qualification, post MS fellowship or a post MD fellowship, then for a pediatric orthopedic surgeon, even if you have 10 arthroscopy publications, it doesn't impress me. But at the same time, tomorrow with the same CV, if you're going to apply for a consultant job somewhere, or if you're going to apply for a say, general orthopedic fellowship somewhere, then it's going to be fine. So it's not that you shouldn't do it, but as you go along, if you continuously show me, so suppose for example, I'll speak only about pediatric orthopedics since I'm one. So if it was a rare dermatological condition which got in the way of a fixation, and then you had to devise a new splint or a new method to still do the fracture. So what was the relevance to my particular subspecialty? If that is there, then I would definitely still encourage that. But if you've been all over the place and there's just no focus, so if somebody sends me a CV and says, I'd like to get a spine fellowship as well as a pediatric fellowship, then that doesn't make sense to me. So that very early on in life, you have to sort out where you want to go.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, because like even when I got involved in research, I have papers in like ENT and molecular medicine and all. But I think what matters is after 5 years, if I have this broad base of research and I move on to the specific specialty that I want to, that's what would matter, because having a broad base wouldn't affect you, at least in the MBBS years. But as you move along, that's what
It
matters.
will matter when you have two candidates with 10 papers and 12 papers in front of you, and you have to then analyze which one CV is more suitable for your job. The job has to suit you, and you have to suit the job, both vice versa.
Absolutely.
But what should be our approach if suppose we are interested in a particular field, but we cannot really find a mentor who is entertaining us when we ask them for help in research, for example. We don't have a mentor. What alternatives do we have, or what would you suggest? For example, if I want to do research in general medicine, but there is no one in general medicine, there is a particular professor in surgery who is into research. But I want to do it in general medicine. So what alternatives do I have, and how do I proceed?
You could do a observership somewhere in an institute where they do encourage research. You could still have a student group amongst yourself and say 4 or 5 of y'all, but you will still need a guidance from someone, and put that data together and try and keep it short term then. Keep it a very tangible and very focused, narrow study. And then as you go ahead in your career, when you enter general medicine residency, that time you pick up some topic which is bigger and better. There will always be opportunities at every level. Remember, this is just 1 year, so it's a passing phase. Or take up population-based studies. That's another way of doing things, but that's a lot of hard work. Dr. Benjamin Joseph, who is one of our senior most pediatric orthopedic surgeons, he did a cross-sectional study in the entire South Canara belt in school children of how many of them are flat-footed. So imagine the time and effort he must have spent. But even you can do it, population-based that way also. You don't need a mentor for that then. So if you want to go ahead and in school children say, I want to study the level of vitamin D, so then don't try and choose anything invasive. Then you could say, we just want to see how much of play hours and how much of sunlight daily exposure they are getting. Something like that. Choose something that is relevant, simple, and change your avenues where you're going to conduct the research. Or say the typical type of midday meal, we want to study the constituents of that. So good. I think I see a lot of young, bright researchers coming up.
Yes, ma'am. We have about 120 people who are on YouTube Live with us right now.
How nice is that?
Yeah, and we had almost 1,200 people that signed up for this. But what I had also recommended to these students was that they can have groups of 3 or 4 working in different colleges. So even if one college has a person who is, very active in, say, medicine or general surgery, who's not active in your college, you could leave the competitive spirit at the door and join each other and really.
You can pull your data. There'll be specific rules to it. Go through the ethics committee. But design your study well. I think there is no alternative to that. If you design your study well, and if your data is robust, then you can always publish later.
Absolutely. Right. Are there any
ma'am, there's one question. Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, sure.
Can a UG student apply for a patent?
Yeah.
I think so. Why not? I mean, depends on what your product is.
Absolutely. So Dr. Parag yesterday, I think the questions, Dr. Parag yesterday spoke about patents and innovation, and that's where this question is stemming from. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, even though there are 12-year-old kids with patents in the India, I don't think that should be an issue. Absolutely, it's just novelty and what you need to do. Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, ma'am. I think we've taken too much of your time. Thank you so much for attending. It's truly been an
No
honor
problem.
to have
It's
you.
been a pleasure.
Thank
It's
you
been a
so
pleasure,
much for
and
answering
all
our
the best to
questions.
all of you. This too shall pass, and I'm so glad that you all are investing your time in COVID, trying to do something good and fruitful. So keep it up. All the
Thank you
best.
so much, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Take
ma'am.
care.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
So, all right, guys, we still have about 10 to 20 minutes. So let's talk about statistics. Just a short 10-minute presentation on statistics, if you guys would like, so that you can understand what exactly goes on in a paper. And then we'll end this 3-day workshop thanks to IMA-MSN, who got in touch with me regarding this. So let's talk briefly about statistics in medicine and what role it plays and how you can identify different sort of statistical values that you see in papers. So statistics is basically used for planning, designing, collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and reporting. I know they all sound like synonyms, but when in the planning phase also, you need your statistics. While designing your study, you need your statistics. And this will all be done only if you approach a statistician before you start your paper. And obviously you need, while analyzing and interpreting your data. So we all see statistics as this behemoth of p-values and r-values and t-tests and complicated graphs and charts, but it doesn't need to be so. I'll give you some information regarding some basic statistics that are seen in most papers so that you can understand them. So without statistics, you'd be looking at individual results. You cannot interpret your results. Mean, median, mode are also part of statistics. And this ranges from simple means to complex regression analysis. So statistics is in everything and anything you do. Otherwise, you'd be reporting individual data to in your paper, which would be unreadable. So there are essentially two types of data: quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative, like we discussed yesterday, the qualitative types of studies where which are usually used in psychology, but quantitative can be further divided into three, which is categorical, ordinal, and scale. So categorical data is something like yes or no, which is two categories, right? And ordinal basically means it's an order. So if you have someone complaining of pain, and if you have a scale of 1 to 9, so a 6 is more than a 5, but a yes is not more than a no, or a no is not more than a yes, right? Or if a person is a male or female, then a female is not more than a male, or a male is not more than a female, right? So that's called categorical. But ordinal is when there is a particular order to things, and it would range from say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc. And the scale is something that is continuous. So like a BP, which can range from 120 to 121, 122, 123, etc. So that's called a scale variable, where it's not divided into classes itself. It is just numbers which have which go on for quite a long time. Now, why this is important is because there are different statistical tests applied to the different types of data. So usually t-tests are just for scale data. They are not used for ordinal or categorical data, which a lot of people do during when they present their surveys, which I have seen in paper presentations. So that's why it's important to understand the difference between these three things. Again, a scale data can be of two types. It could be continuous, which is blood sugar level. It can be 143.2, 143.3, etc. Or it can be an interval, which is pulse, which is 72 or 73. So there is no decimal point essentially between continuous and interval. Ordinal data again means that it's ordered. So how much would you like this course? Would you rate on scale of 1 to 5? It has an order. So 5 is more than 1, is more than 3. So there is an order to things, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, not 5, 2, then 3, then 1. I hope that's easy to understand. And if someone votes 1 and someone votes 5, it's not the same thing. There's an order from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And other than instead of saying male or female, which would not have an order. So again, nominal means that there is no order of data. Are you male or female? Do you like this course? Yes or no. That would come under the nominal or categorical data category. So there are a few tests that we use. The most common is usually, as we all know, the student's t-test. It determines whether the mean of two groups is equal. So like I said yesterday, try to have the help of a statistician. It's because the use of this test requires certain parameters or certain assumptions to be met. So as in statistics, it's not one size fits all, where you have one test which can be used for any and all data you have, or where there is a normality assumption. The data needs to be parametric. It needs to be independent samples or dependent if you are using a paired one. But so there has to be certain parameters that need to be met, which the statistician will evaluate once you give him your data. After evaluating, he will determine whether or not you can use the student t-test on your data, right? Then you have something called the p-value, which is usually confuses a lot of people, but it is actually a very simple phrase, right? So p-value basically refers to something called a probability value. So whenever you have something, right? Consider I have a dice with 5 sides of that dice have the number 1, and the 6th side of the dice has the number 2. So the probability of me getting a number 1 is 5 on 6, right? And the probability of me getting a number 2 is 1 on 6, correct? I hope we understand that from our maths days back in the 10th, 11th, or 12th grade. So that's the probability value, right? So whenever we are conducting any test, okay, it's possible that you are getting the results of the test are just by chance. So suppose you are trying to evaluate the difference between the blood pressure of the male and female, consider, okay? It is possible that because you are not evaluating the total population, right? You are evaluating samples from there. So while sampling, right, it's possible just by chance that you take all the people who have high BP in females and all the low people who have low BP in males, right? It's possible. It's very unlikely, but it's still possible, right? So that is the probability value, okay? So when you are comparing them, you will find that the females have very high BP because by chance you have taken all the females who have taken high BP as in your sample and all the males who have low BP in your sample, right? So by chance you will see that the females have higher BP than males, correct? So the chances of that happening should be less than 5%, correct? That's when you say that this is statistically significant, okay? So whatever results you are getting from the particular test, okay, they will all be associated with the p-value. So if the test is statistically significant, you say that only when the chance of the result that you have gotten from that test, that you would get it by chance, just because of the factor of chance, that just by chance you picked up all the high BP people and females, that should be less than 5%. That's when you say that your results are statistically significant. And where does this 5% come from? Is just something that we as a community have decided, that the p-value should be less than 0.05, which means that there should be less than a 5% chance that the results are obtained, or there's a 5% probability that the results are obtained just due to the factor of chance, okay? The 0.05 is not a golden thing that God has dropped down to us and told us about this. It's just we as a community have decided that we will use this 5%, that, and if to obtain the results, the probability of obtaining these particular results just by chance is less than 5%, then we will accept that it is not by chance and we will consider it significant. Okay, so that's the meaning of what a p-value is. So rolling of a dice, you roll one die 6 times, your friend rolls another die 6 times. You get results as 1, 6, 6, 3, 4, 1. Okay, your friend gets his die results as 1, 2, 5, 3, 4, 2. Mind you, you have rolled it 6 times, and that's why there are 6 numbers written here. So is there a chance, so is there something wrong with his dice where he has not even gotten 6 once and you have gotten 6 twice? No, right? It's just a factor of chance, correct? It's just by chance that he did not happen to get even 1 6 when he rolled his dice and you did. So that's where the probability comes in. It basically shows that whether the test that has been applied to the data showed the difference due to chance, or there is some other underlying factor that is affecting the results. So if you have given salt, say 10 grams of salt to a group of 100 people, and 20 gram and 1 gram of salt to a group of another 100 people, right? when you're trying to evaluate their BPs, you will compare the BPs in the two groups, and you will see that the BP in the people who you've given 10 grams of salt to every day is higher than the BP you have given to the group who has been given only 1 gram of salt. Correct? So when you apply the test, you will basically see that if your probability of getting a difference between these two groups is less than 5, then you say that there is another underlying factor which is causing this change, which is causing this higher BP in one group and lower BP in the other group, and that we take as the salt intake because that's the intervention we have done. So that's the basic point of p values. This is something called a normal curve, where um, so the center is basically a median where you have 50% probability that the outcome is above or below a 7. So if you roll a dice, and if you roll 2 dice and you get the chance of you getting a 7 is the highest, right? Because there can be multiple numbers associated. You can get a 6, 1, 5, 2, 4, 3, etc. But you get the chance of you getting a 12 would be exceedingly low, right? So that is at the rightmost, and the chance of you getting a 1 would be the same as you getting a getting a 2 would be the same as you getting a 12, right? On these 2 dice, because there's only one possibility each where you get these numbers. So this is basically the probability of you getting the results, and that's called the normal curve. This is something called a normal distribution, and it is essentially something that your data should meet when you're trying to use these students' t-tests and pair tests, etc. So this is just an example of a normal distribution where where this normal distribution is important is when you're taking the BP or the pulse of someone, it would usually follow a normal distribution where you would see very less number of people with BP about 240. So they'd be probably in this 0.013 part of this distribution. And there'll be a lot of people with BP 120 by 80. So they will be in this. So that's why this graph shows the highest number of people in the center, right? There'll be a lot of people with 120, 80. Again, there'll be a very few people with BP of say 70, 30 or 70, 50, right? Again, they'll be in the leftmost part of this normal distribution. That's why there's a distribution that you see where the most common values will be in the center. And as the values change, so suppose from 120, the BP goes 130, there'll be lesser people you find. Then 140, lesser people with 140, 150, lesser people with 150. Same this way, so there'll be lesser people with 100 systolic, lesser people with 90 systolic, lesser people with 60 systolic, etc. That's why there's a normal distribution that is formed. So if you consider this line, there's dots that make up this line. This is the distribution that you will find. That's essentially the basics of statistics that you need. You've understood the basics of p-value. You've understood the basics of what a normal distribution is. And I think this is a good place to end our 3-day workshop. We have covered as much as we can. If you guys still have any questions, feel free to write to me at contact us at pubgeek.co, or and please feel free to follow our Instagram and our YouTube channels. I'd be forwarding the videos to the IMA-MSN team. They'll also be having the videos online for at least a week so that you can come back, take any screenshots you want, be comfortable with the information you've been provided. And I'm sure we'll be having many more conferences like this in the future. So keep in touch with the PubGeek Instagram page, and we also have a Facebook page. And remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel, so whenever we go live, you get a notification and you can join in and see what discussion we're having. So is the IMA-MSN team online?
Yes, sir.
Guys, it's been a pleasure to collaborate with you all and have this workshop. It's truly been very successful. We've had a lot of people giving their attendance, although not many have attended. But yeah, there's nothing we can do about that. But it's truly been a pleasure. If you guys ever want to work with me in the future, you know where to reach me. And we share the attendance link on the groups today. And I think when you'll all be giving the certificates to the participants?
By 2 weeks.
By 2 weeks. Perfect. All right. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. If you guys again have any questions, feel free to write to me at contact us at pubgeek.co, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have. All right. See you. Have a happy
Thanks.
Sunday.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you.
you. Bye-bye.